Assyrian Empire, the rise and fall. A land between two rivers. Imagine a land where two great rivers carve their way through plains of sun-hardened clay and shimmering sand. The Tigris and the Euphrates. Their waters rise and fall with the seasons feeding a narrow ribbon of fertile soil in a landscape otherwise barren and unforgiving. This is Mesopotamia, literally the land between rivers, and it would become the beating heart of the world's first civilizations. Today we call this region Iraq. But 5,000 years ago, it was the cradle of civilization. Here, beneath the relentless sun and beside unpredictable floods, people first learned to control nature, or at least to live with it. They dug canals, built levees, and planted barley in the silt-rich earth. They built cities from mud brick and temples that reached skyward like steps toward the gods. And in this land, where life teetered between abundance and disaster, power was born. The rivers gave life, but they also demanded order. And so writing was born not to tell stories, but to keep track of grain. The earliest script cuneiform was pressed into soft clay tablets to record taxes, trade offerings, and laws. With writing came hierarchy. With hierarchy came kings, and with kings came war. By 3000 BCE, this narrow crescent of land had birthed cities like Uruk-ur and Eridu. These were the world's first true urban centers, complete with markets, walls, armies, and bureaucracy. They rose from the mud like islands of control in a sea of wilderness, and their power attracted others. To the north, beyond the lush floodplains and into the harsher uplands, another city began to take shape. A place less known, less glorious at first, but destined for greatness, Ashur. This city, founded along the banks of the Tigris, would one day give its name to an empire that would stretch from Egypt to the Persian Gulf. But in the early days, Ashur was just a modest town, a rough outpost on the fringe of Sumerian and Akkadian worlds. Yet its position was strategic, not too far north to be cut off from the southern cities, and not too deep into the wild mountains to be threatened by tribal raids. Ashur sat at a crossroads between merchants and warriors, between cultures and empires, between survival and ambition. In time, this city would learn to emulate its richer neighbors to the south. It would adopt their gods, their scripts, and their statecraft. But it would never be content to merely follow. In the centuries to come, it would dominate. For now, though, the stage was being set. As the rivers swelled and receded, as priests raised ziggurats and scribes counted barley, the rhythms of Mesopotamian life shaped something far more enduring than mere harvests. They were building a way of thinking, a way of ruling, a way of expanding. What began as farming villages along the riverbanks became organized city-states with codes of law, religious authority, and standing armies. And those cities, in turn, became the seeds of empires. The Assyrians were not the first to rise from this ancient soil, but they would become its most relentless heirs. In the centuries to come, they would master war, reshape politics, and etch their legacy in both clay and blood. But before they could rule the world, they had to survive its storms and learn from its masters. 2. Ashur, a city born of stone and sand. In the dusty northern stretch of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris carved its silver path through a harsher, more rugged land, a settlement quietly emerged. This was Ashur, named after the god who would one day become synonymous with empire. Founded around 2500 BCE, Ashur was not the shining metropolis that Ur or Babylon would become. It was humble, practical, fortified by its geography and shaped by its trade. Perched on a natural limestone bluff overlooking the river, Ashur was more fortress than palace, more marketplace than temple. Yet in its stone foundations and coarse streets lay the DNA of empire. The city's early years were defined not by conquest, but by commerce. Ashur became a node in the great web of trade that stretched from the mountains of Anatolia to the cities of Sumer. Merchants from Ashur loaded boats with textiles and tin paddling up and down the Tigris. In return, they brought back silver, copper, and luxury goods from the north, lapis lazuli, obsidian, even amber from far-off lands. These traders weren't mere peddlers. They were diplomats, emissaries, the soft power behind a city yet to find its voice in war. Culturally, Ashur stood between worlds. To the south, the Sumerians had already developed writing kingship and mythology. To the west and north, tribal groups like the Hurrians and Gutians lived in smaller, looser societies. Ashur borrowed from the Sumerians their cuneiform script, their gods, their ziggurats, but it kept a northern character, disciplined, proud, and patient. It's from this intersection of culture and geography that Ashur's identity was born. Even before Assyria existed in name, the city of Ashur had begun to think of itself as something different. Not just another city-state, but a people with a destiny. And central to that destiny was the god Ashur himself. Unlike the storm gods or fertility deities of the south, Ashur evolved into a unique symbol, a god of war, justice, and kingship, all rolled into one. He was both divine patron and national identity. When Assyrian kings marched to war centuries later, it was in his name. And when they carved their victories into stone, it was his symbol-winged disc and bow that hovered over every triumph. But Ashur's early kings were not yet conquerors. Names like Tudia and Ushpia, recorded in much later chronicles, hint at a time when kingship was still fragile, negotiated, perhaps even elected. These rulers were likely priest-kings, intermediaries between the divine and the practical. They oversaw trade deals, temple offerings, and local defenses. They were custodians, not emperors. Still, something was shifting. As the southern cities of Sumer rose and fell, caught in their endless cycles of rivalry and revenge, Ashur remained steady. Observing, learning, preparing. Its alliance with the Akkadian Empire under Sargon the Great in the 24th century BCE was one such turning point. Akkad, the world's first empire, swept across Mesopotamia with military might and bureaucratic precision. And while many cities were crushed or absorbed, Ashur adapted. Rather than resist, it cooperated. Rather than revolt, it embedded itself in the machinery of empire. In doing so, Ashur gained something far more valuable than independence. It gained experience. When the Akkadian Empire collapsed under the weight of invasion and climate disaster around 2150 BCE, Ashur was still standing, still trading, still worshipping its god. And it was watching, always watching. The city's survival through these early centuries is a testament not to brute force but to strategic patience. Ashur did not rush into the power vacuum left by Akkad. It waited. It built. It studied the mistakes of those who rose too fast and fell too hard. In time, this quiet city of merchants and priests would give rise to kings who were anything but modest. Kings who would paint the walls of palaces with blood and glory. Kings who would reduce cities to ash and proclaim it righteous. But that world had not yet come. For now, Ashur remained a sentinel in stone and sand, humble, determined, enduring. And in its silence it dreamed of empire. 3. The shadow of Akkad and the first kings. Long before Assyria wielded the sword of empire, it lived in the shadow of another, the Akkadians. In the 24th century BCE, Sargon of Akkad forged a political and military machine that stunned Mesopotamia. From the southern heartland of Agade, his empire surged across city-states, absorbing Sumer, Elam, and the north. He became the first king to unify the lands between the rivers under a single rule. And as the Akkadian Empire grew, so too did its appetite for tribute labor and obedience. Ashur, then still modest in stature, found itself at the edge of this vast and growing leviathan. It was neither rebel nor rival. Instead, it watched cautious but opportunistic. The city accepted the suzerainty of Akkad, possibly paying tribute and hosting imperial officials. In return, it gained protection and access to the sprawling Akkadian trade networks that reached as far as the Indus Valley and Anatolia. It is in this period that we encounter the shadowy figures of early Assyrian kings. Names like Tudia Adamu Yangi and Ushpia are listed in much later king lists. Whether they were real rulers or mythologized ancestors is uncertain. What is more telling is how the Assyrians themselves remembered them. Tudia is often cited as the first monarch of Assyria, a man who forged early treaties perhaps with northern tribes and laid the foundation of kingship in Ashur. Ushpia, a later figure, is credited with building the first temple to Ashur, transforming the god from a local deity into the spiritual heart of a rising people. These were not kings in the imperial sense. They did not rule over provinces or command armies across continents, but they represented the first spark of Assyrian identity, a belief that they were more than just another city on the map. The fall of Akkad, around 2150 BCE, marked a turning point. A combination of external invasions by Gutian tribes and internal unrest shattered the empire's foundations. Drought and famine compounded the collapse, plunging Mesopotamia into chaos. Many cities burned, some were abandoned altogether. But Ashur endured. And more importantly, Ashur adapted. As Akkad crumbled, Ashur stepped into the vacuum, not as a conqueror, but as a survivor. The city began to act independently again, forming its own alliances, managing its own trade routes, and asserting control over nearby lands. The transition from city-state to kingdom was not sudden but gradual. It emerged from necessity, defending its walls, feeding its people, managing resources once controlled by a distant empire. The Assyrians began to adopt elements of Akkadian statecraft, but with their own twist. Where Akkad had centralized power in a singular imperial capital, the Assyrians distributed authority among temple palace and merchant classes. Ashur was ruled not just by a king, but by a council balancing sacred civil and commercial interests. Religion, too, took on a sharper political edge. The god Ashur was no longer just the city's protector. He became the divine embodiment of Assyrian destiny. His name would grace every future king, his will would justify every campaign. In time, loyalty to Ashur would be indistinguishable from loyalty to the empire itself. This fusion of piety and power would become a hallmark of Assyrian kingship. Yet in these early centuries, expansion was still modest. The Assyrians were not yet the hammer of the Near East. They had no imperial army, no vast bureaucracy, but they had a memory of Akkad's rise and fall. And they had ambition shaped not by dreams of sudden conquest, but by the patience of those who outlasted giants. From the scattered records of trade, we know that Ashur began to send merchants deeper into Anatolia and east toward Elam. The seeds of what would later be a formidable commercial and military system were quietly being sown. By 2025 BCE, the world had changed again. The third dynasty of Ur, another Sumerian empire, had risen and fallen. Once more, Mesopotamia was fragmented, and this time Assyria would no longer stay in the shadows. 4. The Old Assyrian Kingdom, 2025 to 1378 BCE. By the early second millennium, BCE, Ashur had evolved from a resilient city-state into the center of a growing kingdom. This era, known as the Old Assyrian period, was not defined by conquest or glory, but by commerce, ingenuity, and survival. In many ways, this was Assyria's adolescence, a time of learning, experimenting, and laying the foundations for the empire it would one day become. Trade was the engine of Assyrian power, and nowhere was this more evident than in the far reaches of Anatolia, where a network of merchant colonies called Karum took root. Chief among them was Karum-Kanesh, located near modern-day Kultepe in Turkey. This outpost became the hub of a vast trading operation connecting Ashur to the mineral-rich lands of the north. Assyrian merchants at Karum-Kanesh were not just traders. They were diplomats, financiers, and record-keepers. They lived in separate districts, built homes in Anatolian cities, and often married local women. Through them, tin and textiles flowed north, while silver and gold flowed south. It was not a state-run economy, but it was remarkably organized. These merchants operated under contracts, paid taxes to both Ashur and local rulers, and kept meticulous records etched into clay tablets in the unmistakable wedge-shaped strokes of cuneiform. Thousands of these tablets have survived buried in the ruins of ancient Kanesh, providing a vivid window into old Assyrian society. They record everything from loan agreements to marriage contracts, and from inheritance disputes to trade licenses. These weren't just numbers, they were the rhythms of life for a civilization that had mastered the art of long-distance trade logistics and finance. Back in Ashur, this commercial boom transformed the city. Wealth poured in, temples expanded, new buildings rose. A distinct class of elite merchant families emerged, some powerful enough to influence royal decisions. The king remained a central figure, but the state was deeply intertwined with its merchant class. In fact, kings themselves often acted as commercial guarantors or arbitrators in disputes. This was a unique model of governance, one where commerce and kingship worked in tandem rather than in competition. And while it lacked the imperial flash of later centuries, it gave Assyria something more durable: resilience. While the great city of Ur collapsed under the weight of invasion and internal strife around 2004 BCE, Ashur weathered the storm. It had no grand palaces to plunder, no massive armies to overextend. What it had was a decentralized, adaptive, and economically robust society. It wasn't just about wealth, it was about learning. Through the Anatolian trade routes, the Assyrians absorbed foreign languages, legal systems, and cultural norms. They developed a distinct dialect of Akkadian. They refined their cuneiform. They began to see themselves not as the periphery of civilization, but as one of its centers. Yet not all was stable. The old Assyrian kingdom remained hemmed in by larger powers, the amorphous tribal world to the north, the Hurrians and later the Mitanni to the west, and Babylon to the south. While trade flourished, military expansion was limited. Assyrian kings such as Ereshkigal I and his successors focused on internal development and diplomacy rather than war. Their inscriptions were modest, their ambitions constrained by the reality of geography and politics. Even so, the kings of this era laid down an ideological foundation. They called themselves vice-regents of Ashur, not gods, not emperors, but servants of their city's divine patron. It was a humble title, yet it would carry immense weight in the centuries to come. By the end of the Old Assyrian period, around 1378 BCE, the world was once again shifting. New powers were rising: the Hittites in the north, the Kassites in Babylon, and the Mitanni in the west. The commercial system that had sustained Assyria for centuries was becoming unstable. Conflict loomed on the horizon. But Assyria had changed. It was no longer just a trading city on the Tigris. It was a kingdom, small but cohesive, rich, literate, and deeply conscious of its identity. And though its armies were not yet feared, its influence was already quietly stretching across mountains and deserts. The sword would come soon. But it was the pen, the contracts, the records, the ledgers that had prepared the ground. A storm was gathering, and Ashur would not stay patient forever. 5. Storm on the horizon. Rise of the Middle Assyrian Empire. As the 14th century BCE unfolded, the world around Assyria grew more turbulent and more tempting. The old trade routes no longer offered the safety or profits they once did. The balance of power in the Near East was breaking down. From the west, the Mitanni kingdom, descendants of Hurrian-speaking tribes, had risen to dominate northern Mesopotamia, casting a long shadow over Ashur. To the south, Babylon simmered with new ambition under Kassite rulers. Assyria stood encircled, its survival uncertain. But this was no longer the cautious merchant city of old. Under the leadership of Ashurbanipal I, who reigned from roughly 1365 to 1330 BCE, Assyria stepped decisively out of the shadows and into the battlefield of empire. This was the dawn of the Middle Assyrian period, and with it the transformation of Assyria from a trade-focused kingdom to a militant regional power. Ashurbanipal I was no passive steward of Ashur's legacy. He was a statesman, a diplomat, and most importantly, a warlord. Early in his reign, he launched military campaigns to the west and south, reclaiming territories once under Mitanni control. With ruthless efficiency, he captured key strongholds and fortified Assyrian borders. For the first time in history, Assyria was projecting power through force, not just trade. One of Ashurbanipal's most significant political moves was marrying his daughter to a Kassite king of Babylon. The aim was to secure peace and prestige, but when her son was murdered in a Babylonian palace coup, Ashurbanipal retaliated with fury. He invaded Babylon, installed a puppet ruler, and made clear to the region Assyria was no longer content to be ignored. This aggressive posture was new. So too was the military machine forming behind it. The Assyrians had begun developing a standing army, organized, disciplined, and loyal to the king. They perfected the use of iron weapons before most of their rivals. Their armies were not just strong, they were mobile. A complex network of supply lines, fortified outposts, and river transports allowed them to campaign swiftly and deep into enemy territory. These were not raids, these were conquests. Over the following century, a series of strong kings followed Ashurbanipal's lead. Arik-den-Eli, Adad-nirari-Lemun, and Shalmaneser III pushed Assyrian borders outward in every direction. They conquered cities, dismantled enemy fortifications, and deported populations to dilute rebellion and repopulate the Assyrian heartland. The fall of Mitanni came in waves. First, its buffer zones were taken. Then its vassals defected. Finally, the capital of Washukani fell under Shalmaneser I around the 13th century BCE. It wasn't just conquest, it was consolidation. These kings restructured the state, organizing territories into provinces directly ruled by Assyrian officials. They built administrative centers, irrigation canals, and military roads. Their records speak not just of glory and battle, but of census-taking, taxation, and provincial management. The engine of empire was turning, and behind it all stood the god Ashur, no longer just the city's patron, but now envisioned as the divine commander of the Assyrian army. The king was his chosen instrument. Every campaign became a holy mission. Victory was not just political, but cosmic. The psychological shift was profound. Assyrian rulers now referred to themselves in exalted terms: King of the universe, King of the four quarters, the mighty one who tramples his enemies. These weren't metaphors. They were mandates. The Middle Assyrian Empire believed that it was chosen to rule and that resistance was rebellion against divine order. Yet, with ambition came cruelty. The Middle Assyrian legal code written around this time reveals a society deeply concerned with control and hierarchy. Punishments were harsh: mutilation, enslavement, and death for offenses ranging from theft to insubordination. This was a culture tightening its grip internally, even as it expanded outward. Still, Assyria's dominance remained regional. It had no coastline, no navy. Egypt remained out of reach. Hatti, the Hittite superpower to the northwest, loomed large. Babylon still simmered. But in northern Mesopotamia, Assyria had become the undisputed master. It had shaken off the shackles of Mitanni rule. It had turned fear into a weapon. And it had redefined its destiny not as a kingdom surviving between empires, but as an empire in its own right. A war machine had been born, and the world would soon know its name. 6. Building a war machine. Tiglath-Pileser I and his legacy. By the end of the 12th century BCE, Assyria had grown confident, hardened by decades of conquest and reform. But it was under one man, Tiglath-Pileser I, that Assyria truly transformed into a fearsome military engine. His reign from 1114 to 1076 BCE marked a high point in the Middle Assyrian Empire, both in territorial reach and ideological clarity. Tiglath-Pileser I was not just a warrior king. He was a strategist, a builder, a writer, and a propagandist. His inscriptions carved into palace walls and temple foundations did more than celebrate victory, they redefined kingship. For Tiglath-Pileser, war was not simply a tool of survival or expansion. It was the divine purpose of the state. From the very beginning of his reign, he moved aggressively. In the west, he marched into the lands of the Arameans, pushing through Syria and reaching the Mediterranean Sea, what he called the Great Sea of the West. It was a symbolic moment an Assyrian king had reached the edge of the known world. He claimed to have hunted wild bulls in the Lebanese mountains and brought back cedar logs, materials essential for royal construction and sacred temples. To the north, he drove into the Anatolian highlands, subduing the Mushki and other tribal groups. These campaigns were not just about land, they were about securing trade routes, timber, and metal. And to the east, he pushed toward the Zagros Mountains, expanding Assyrian influence over the highland tribes and creating buffer zones against future threats. But what made Tiglath-Pileser I truly revolutionary was not just how far he marched, but how he sustained it. He introduced innovations that professionalized the Assyrian military in ways previously unseen. Units were organized with more precision. Supply chains were improved with designated rest stations, food storage centers, and riverine transport systems. Horses previously used mainly for chariots were now trained for cavalry, providing greater speed and flexibility on rough terrain. He also strengthened the bureaucratic foundation of empire. Governors were appointed in newly conquered territories, expected to collect tribute conscript troops and enforce imperial law. These officials were loyal to the king and rotated frequently, reducing the chance of local uprisings. For the first time, Assyria began to look like a centralized state, not just a loose collection of conquered cities. Culturally, Tiglath-Pileser I's reign marked a return to monumental building. In Ashur and elsewhere, temples and palaces rose with grandeur. Reliefs depicted scenes of royal hunts, battle formations, and the king standing above captives, repeating the visual language of domination. But his inscriptions reveal something more personal. Tiglath-Pileser wasn't content to be remembered as a brute force. He boasted of reading ancient tablets, restoring temples, and preserving knowledge. He claimed to have rebuilt the Temple of Ashur in accordance with its original foundation plan. These were not empty boasts. They reflect a king deeply aware of history, legacy, and symbolism. He was building more than an army. He was building identity. Yet even a king as capable as Tiglath-Pileser I could not halt the tides of regional instability. As the 11th century progressed, a broader crisis was unfolding across the Near East. The so-called Late Bronze Age collapse had begun a cataclysm of droughts, famine migrations, and warfare that would level great empires and erase ancient cities. The Hittites vanished. Mycenaean Greece fell into ruin. Egypt barely survived. Assyria too would be shaken. In the final years of Tiglath-Pileser's reign, Aramean tribes began pressing in from the west. They were mobile, relentless, and difficult to subdue. Their raids destabilized trade, disrupted agriculture, and chipped away at Assyrian control. After his death, his successors struggled to maintain momentum. Still, Tiglath-Pileser I had done something profound. He had shown what was possible. He had fused military might, administrative innovation, and divine kingship into a coherent imperial model. And that model would live on even as darkness approached. For though the war machine would stall in the coming decades, its gears were now built of iron. 7. The collapse of bronze darkness and decline. The year was somewhere around 1200 BCE, a moment historians now mark as one of the most profound collapses in ancient history. Across the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, civilizations that had stood for centuries were crumbling. The Late Bronze Age collapse, as we now call it, was not a single event, but a series of interlocking catastrophes, climate shifts, prolonged drought, famine, internal revolt, and waves of mass migration. The great empires and city-states, Hatti-Mycenae Ugarit, were swept away. Even mighty Egypt, though it endured, was permanently weakened. And Assyria, though it stood longer than most, could not escape the storm. In the wake of Tiglath-Pileser I's campaigns, Assyria had seemed poised to dominate. But his death marked the beginning of a long and grinding decline. The empire he had built with its supply lines, governors, and grand ambitions began to fray at the edges. His successors lacked his strength, and the world they inherited was unraveling. One of the greatest threats came not from traditional armies, but from newly mobile peoples, especially the Arameans. These semi-nomadic groups from the Syrian steppe moved with speed and ferocity. Unlike the rigid urbanized states they assaulted, the Arameans thrived in disorder. They raided Assyrian outposts, disrupted trade routes, and in some cases seized territory. Unlike past enemies, they didn't offer a capital to besiege or a king to dethrone. They were everywhere and nowhere. Assyria responded with force. Campaigns were launched. Fortifications were repaired. Garrisons were reinforced. But this was not the clean warfare of earlier conquests. It was irregular, exhausting, and demoralizing. The heartland itself, once a place of security, was now vulnerable to attack. Worse still, nature seemed to conspire against civilization. Drought gripped the region, leading to crop failures and food shortages. Tablets from this period mentioned famine, empty granaries, and people selling land to survive. The carefully maintained irrigation systems fell into disrepair. Without food, without order, the cities began to shrink. Literacy declined. Record-keeping faltered. The cultural light dimmed. Internally, Assyria was weakening. Central authority wavered. Provincial governors grew more autonomous. Some began to act like local kings, collecting taxes but sending fewer troops. The chain of command, once rigid and effective, now sagged under its own weight. The throne itself became unstable, changing hands frequently, sometimes violently. This was not a total collapse. The Assyrian state did not vanish like the Hittites, or fade into myth like Mycenae, but it entered a kind of twilight, a long, uneasy sleep. Ashur, the sacred city, remained intact but quieter. Trade diminished. Building projects slowed. The great inscriptions of conquest were replaced with humble records of survival. For over a century, Assyria would remain in this subdued state, occasionally striking out against its neighbors, but never with the energy or clarity of earlier years. And yet in this darkness, something was preserved. Unlike other cultures that vanished completely, the Assyrians retained their structure. Their scribes still trained. Their temples still functioned. Their military, though diminished, still existed. They had not forgotten who they were, and in time they would rise again. When the dust of the Bronze Age finally settled, a new world had emerged. Iron was replacing bronze. New peoples were filling the power vacuum: the Arameans in Syria, the Hebrews in Canaan, the Medes in the east. The old order was gone, but the Assyrians remembered. They remembered the glories of Tiglath-Pileser. They remembered the conquests of Ashurbanipal. They remembered the structure, the ideology, the engine of war and rule. And in 911 BCE, a new king would take the throne. He would not be content with survival. He would reclaim the storm. 8. The Neo-Assyrian revival begins. 911 BCE. The long night was ending. By the early 10th century BCE, Assyria had endured centuries of decline, raids, and stagnation. Yet it had not disappeared. It had waited, its temples still standing, its scribes still writing, its soldiers still training in the shadow of former greatness. And then in 911 BCE, a new king ascended the throne. His name was Adad-nirari II. With him, the Neo-Assyrian Empire was born, not in name alone, but in power, ambition, and precision. Adad-nirari II was not a flamboyant figure, but he was disciplined, focused, determined. His mission was not just to rule Assyria, but to rebuild it from the inside out. His first priority: reclaim the heartland. Assyria's core cities, Ashur, Nineveh, Arbela, had been isolated for too long. Farmers feared raids. Trade routes lay fractured. Provincial loyalty was weak. So Adad-nirari marched, not with poetic proclamations, but with hard campaigns. He struck against the Arameans who had lingered too long in the valleys and hills. He drove them west, recapturing key towns and re-establishing military control over northern Mesopotamia. Each city he reclaimed was not just a military prize, it was a node in the web of state power. Governors were reappointed. Tribute was collected. Temples were restored. Roads were cleared. The gears of the empire, long rusted, began to turn once more. And then came the reform. Adad-nirari II understood that raw conquest was not enough. To endure, Assyria needed organization, consistency, and speed. He implemented a logistics network based on supply depots and fortified way stations. Troops could now move faster and further than before, marching in organized waves, fed by prepared stocks of grain and water. This new system gave Assyria a critical edge. It could strike quickly, sustain itself deep in enemy territory, and react to rebellion before it spread. The revival wasn't limited to the sword. Administration was reshaped. Land was redistributed to reward loyal soldiers and officials. Royal decrees were enforced by a chain of bureaucrats who recorded everything: grain, cattle, tribute, births, deaths. The empire began to breathe like a single organism again. Foreign policy, too, shifted. Assyria moved from a reactive stance to a proactive one. Adad-nirari launched campaigns into Babylonia, challenging its southern rival and staking a claim to borderlands long contested. He didn't raise Babylon. He outmaneuvered it, using both diplomacy and force to secure advantage. Under his reign, the ideological framework of Assyrian kingship solidified. The king was no longer just a servant of Ashur. He was the arm of Ashur's will on earth. Every conquest was a sacred duty. every reform a divine responsibility. This belief gave legitimacy to expansion and discipline to administration. Dissent was not just rebellion against the king, it was blasphemy against heaven. When Adad-nirari II died in 891 BCE, he left more than an army or a treasury. He left momentum. His successors, Tukulti-Ninurta II, then Ashurbanipal II, would ride this momentum forward. They would build on his military foundation, adopt and expand his administrative reforms, and elevate the Neo-Assyrian Empire to terrifying brilliance. But it began here with a quiet king in a broken land stitching together the remnants of a fallen world. By the end of his reign, Assyria was no longer a survivor of the Bronze Age. It was the forerunner of a new order, and its roar was just beginning to echo across the plains. 9. Iron and Empire. The reign of Ashurbanipal II. In 883 BCE, a new king ascended the Assyrian throne. His name Ashurbanipal II. Where his predecessors had rebuilt the machine of empire brick by brick, ledger by ledger, he would ignite it. His reign marked the true awakening of the Neo-Assyrian Empire and the beginning of a campaign of expansion, cruelty, and psychological domination that the ancient world had never witnessed on such a scale. Ashurbanipal II was not merely a king. He was an architect of terror. From the first year of his reign, he made it clear submission was peace, resistance was annihilation. His army, drilled and mobile thanks to the logistics system inherited from Adad-nirari II, swept across the Zagros Mountains to the east, into the Armenian highlands to the north, and westward toward the Levant. He brought fire and iron with him. Where others ruled by diplomacy, Ashurbanipal ruled by fear. City after city fell not only because of superior force, but because of the stories that came ahead of his armies. Tales of flayed captives, impaled rebels, and entire populations deported to distant lands traveled faster than his banners. And Ashurbanipal made sure of it. He had his victories carved into palace walls, literally. Long flowing reliefs showed him slaying lions, marching through conquered lands, and pouring out the entrails of enemy kings before their own people. His inscriptions, written in cuneiform, spared no detail. I built a pillar over his city gate, and I flayed all the chief men. I covered the pillar with their skins. This wasn't just sadism. It was policy. Ashurnasirpal understood something vital: fear was faster than steel. But brutality alone cannot sustain an empire. Ashurnasirpal was also a builder and a planner. He moved the capital from the ancient city of Ashur to Kalhu, known today as Nimrud. There he launched one of the most ambitious construction projects in Assyrian history. He raised walls, dug canals, built ziggurats, and filled the city with sculptures, palaces, and temples. The northwest palace of Kalhu was a masterpiece of Assyrian power, its walls adorned with bas-reliefs depicting military triumphs, hunting scenes, and the divine presence of Ashur. Its purpose was clear: to impress, to intimidate, to endure. Kalhu became the new nerve center of the empire, a model for future capitals like Nineveh and Dur-Sharrukin. From here, governors were dispatched, tribute was collected, and campaigns were launched. Ashurnasirpal filled it with scribes, artisans, and administrators deported from every corner of his growing realm. Indeed, deportation became another weapon of state. Entire populations, tens of thousands at a time, were uprooted and resettled. Skilled workers were moved to where they were needed, most blacksmiths to arms workshops, farmers to depopulated fields, builders to frontier towns. This wasn't random cruelty, it was strategic demography. Rebellion became harder when communities were fractured and strangers surrounded you. Even the economy was reshaped. With new territory came new resources: timber from the Levant, copper from Anatolia, horses from the steppe. These flowed back to Kalhu along new roads, guarded by garrisons policed by loyal governors. The empire was becoming more than a kingdom. It was now an organism centralized, multi-ethnic, and tightly controlled. Ashurbanipal also understood the importance of spectacle. He famously threw a banquet for the inauguration of Kalhu that, according to his own records, fed nearly 70,000 guests over 10 days. This was more than celebration. It was a message Assyria was not returning to glory. It had already arrived. And yet under the grandeur and stone cracks always lurked. Ashurbanipal's reign, while glorious on the surface, had sown seeds of fear and exhaustion. The deportations, while effective, bred resentment. The heavy tributes strained client kings, and though his military was unmatched, it was stretched thin. But for the moment, the world was in awe and in terror. Ashurbanipal II died in 859 BCE, leaving behind an empire larger, richer, and more centralized than any before in Assyrian history. His son Shalmaneser III would inherit the throne, and a war machine ready to march further west. The empire's engine had been ignited, and now it was rolling. 10. The war king Shalmaneser III and the march west. When Ashurbanipal II died in 859 BCE, the world held its breath, not because Assyria had fallen, but because its successor was his son Shalmaneser III. The world already knew what the father had done, but the son, cold, methodical, and relentless, would push the war machine even further. Shalmaneser III reigned for over 3 decades, from 859 to 824 BCE. In that time, he led more than 30 military campaigns across Syria into Israel, against the Urartians to the north, and down toward the Persian Gulf. Unlike his father, who had focused on consolidation and internal infrastructure, Shalmaneser looked outward. His was a reign of expansion, conquest, and overwhelming pressure. The core philosophy was simple. Assyria had to keep marching, or it would fall apart. One of Shalmaneser's most famous campaigns came in 853 BCE, at the Battle of Karkar. There, a grand coalition of Levantine kings stood against him, an unusual alliance of traditional enemies united by fear. Among them were Hadadezer of Damascus, Ahab of Israel, and others from Hamath Aram and Phoenicia. Together they fielded one of the largest recorded armies of the time. The battle was brutal. War chariots thundered across dust-choked fields. Arrows darkened the sky. The clash was enormous and inconclusive. Shalmaneser claimed victory, of course. His inscriptions described the enemy as routed and shattered. But the fact that the coalition held and that the campaign did not result in full conquest suggests a harder truth: Assyria had met real resistance. Still, the message had been sent. The king of Assyria was willing to march across the known world to enforce tribute. And his message traveled not only by sword, but by stone. Monumental art played a central role in Shalmaneser's reign. The most famous example is the Black Obelisk, an extraordinary 4-sided monument covered in carvings and cuneiform. It shows Shalmaneser receiving tribute from 5 conquered kings, including Jehu of Israel. In one panel, Jehu is shown bowing to the Assyrian king, his forehead to the ground. This was not just propaganda, it was theology. To submit to the king of Assyria was to submit to the divine order of the universe. These images were placed in city squares, temples, and palaces. They weren't meant for local pride. They were messages to friend and foe alike. This is what awaits those who obey, and this is what happens to those who resist. Shalmaneser's campaigns also focused heavily on the northern highlands, especially against the kingdom of Urartu, a rising power based around Lake Van in modern-day Turkey. The Urartians were organized, militarized, and ambitious. They controlled mountain passes and metal resources that Assyria desperately needed. For years, Shalmaneser waged war in this region, never fully conquering it, but keeping its ambitions in check. To the east and southeast, his armies marched along the Zagros Mountains, subjugating tribal confederations and securing trade routes to Elam and the Persian Gulf. In these campaigns, Assyria's deep supply lines, fortified depots, and administrative clarity gave it a logistical edge. Yet even as the empire expanded, pressure built from within. Too many campaigns, too much tribute, too many soldiers stationed too far from home. By the last years of his reign, rebellion stirred not from enemies abroad, but from within his own family. Shalmaneser's son, Ashurbanipal, led a revolt against him, gaining support from provincial governors and key cities. The civil war was prolonged and bloody, dragging on for years. It nearly tore the empire in half. Only the intervention of another son, Shamshi-Adad V, saved Assyria from total fracture. He defeated the rebellion and eventually succeeded the throne, but the cost was high. The war had exposed the limits of fear and expansion. It had shown that Assyria's enemies were not always beyond its borders. Still, despite the internal conflict, Shalmaneser III had achieved something monumental. He had pushed Assyrian power to the borders of Egypt, brought the Levant to its knees, and carved his name in stone and memory. He had made it clear Assyria would not fade quietly. But the empire was beginning to wobble under its own weight. Rebellion was no longer rare, it was expected. Tributary kings began to plot in secret. The loyalty of the provinces grew thin. To survive, Assyria would need more than war. It would need reform. And it would find its answer in a king whose very name echoed terror and transformation, Tiglath-Pileser III. 11. A new order, Tiglath-Pileser III, and imperial reform. In 745 BCE, after years of instability, rebellion, and dynastic conflict, Assyria stood on a knife's edge. The vast empire built by Ashurbanipal and Shalmaneser had not collapsed, but it had stagnated. Governors acted like kings. Provinces faltered. Tribute lagged. The war machine was still formidable, but rust had begun to gather. Then came Tiglath-Pileser III. He did not rise peacefully. He seized the throne in what many scholars believe was a coup, toppling the ruling dynasty during a time of unrest. But from the moment he took power, one thing became clear: this was no ordinary king. Tiglath-Pileser III reigned 745 to 727 BCE, was an administrator, a general, a tactician, and a revolutionary. His first act was not war, but reform. He recognized that the old system built on semi-independent vassals and tribute-based loyalty was fragile. Rebellions flared up too easily. Tax collection was inconsistent. Governors grew too powerful, turning their provinces into personal fiefdoms. And so Tiglath-Pileser set about restructuring the empire at its core. He broke the power of the provincial lords. Instead of hereditary governors, he appointed loyal officials, often from humble backgrounds, who owed their positions solely to him. Provinces were subdivided to prevent any single man from commanding too much territory or force. And for the first time, Assyria shifted from a system of tribute to one of direct rule. This was a revolution in governance. No longer would conquered territories be allowed to rule themselves in exchange for gifts. Now they were annexed, reorganized, and governed directly by Assyrian officials. Taxes were assessed uniformly. Troops were conscripted systematically. Roads were repaired or built anew to speed communication between the king and his governors. It wasn't just political. It was infrastructural. Tiglath-Pileser created an empire that could breathe, react, and strike fast. And strike he did. Once his house was in order, Tiglath-Pileser turned outward. His campaigns were swift, brutal, and methodical. In the west, he shattered Aramean kingdoms, annexing their lands as new Assyrian provinces. He marched into Phoenicia, forcing Tyre and Sidon to submit. In Israel, he intervened in political disputes and installed puppet kings, most notably Menahem, who paid heavy tribute to secure his throne. His inscription at Kalhu boasted, "I received tribute from Kushtashpi, of Kumuhu Rezin of Damascus, Menahem of Samaria, Hiram of Tyre." It reads like a roll call of the Levant. To the south, he clashed with Babylon. But unlike his predecessors, Tiglath-Pileser understood that simply defeating Babylon militarily wasn't enough. He sought legitimacy. In a shrewd political move, he crowned himself king of Babylon in 729 BCE. In doing so, he claimed both the military dominance of Assyria and the cultural prestige of Babylon, a city still seen by many as the spiritual heart of Mesopotamia. But it wasn't just tactics. It was ideology. Under Tiglath-Pileser III, Assyrian kingship reached new heights of divinity and centralization. The king was no longer just a servant of Ashur, he was the living embodiment of Assyrian supremacy. He ruled all peoples in all directions. The title King of the Four Quarters of the Earth returned with full force. His army, too, was transformed. He professionalized the military structure, making service year-round and organizing regiments by function infantry cavalry, siege corps, supply lines. He pioneered the use of cavalry as an independent striking force, breaking the reliance on chariots. His siege warfare tactics improved with sappers undermining walls and engineers constructing ramps and battering rams with terrifying efficiency. Cities that once stood for centuries fell in days, but his rule was not built on destruction alone. Captured peoples were not simply slaughtered, they were relocated. Tens of thousands were deported from their homelands and resettled in distant corners of the empire. Farmers, artisans, and soldiers were moved like pieces on a board. This prevented revolt and stimulated local economies. It also accelerated cultural blending, spreading the Akkadian language and Assyrian customs far and wide. The empire was now a machine, centralized, controlled, coldly effective. When Tiglath-Pileser III died in 727 BCE, he left an Assyria utterly transformed. What had once been a powerful kingdom of shifting borders was now a true superstate, rigid, fearsome, and ideologically self-assured. But empires do not stand still. His successor would inherit not only a throne but a mission. The grip would tighten, and under Sargon II, the world would feel it. 12. Babylon, Egypt, and the grip of Sargon II. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian throne passed into the hands of a man named Sargon II. His exact lineage is debated. Some claim he was the brother of Tiglath-Pileser III. Others say he was a usurper. But what matters more than bloodline is what he did with the crown. Sargon II, r. 722-705 BCE, inherited an empire already reshaped by reform, held firm by bureaucracy, and driven by a divine ideology of conquest. Yet his reign would push those systems further into conquest on three fronts: Israel, Babylon, and Egypt. He began with war. The kingdom of Israel, long a thorn in the side of Assyrian ambition, had rebelled under King Hoshea. Sargon's predecessor had already besieged the capital Samaria, but it was under Sargon that the city finally fell. In 722 BCE, after a brutal siege, Samaria was captured. The consequences were chilling. Tens of thousands of Israelites were deported. They were scattered across the Assyrian Empire, some sent to the east, others into Mesopotamian cities. This was no isolated incident. It was policy one that had become routine under Assyrian rule. The goal was clear: to break national identity, prevent rebellion, and repopulate key regions with loyal, productive subjects. The fall of Samaria marked the beginning of the so-called Lost 10 Tribes of Israel, a population fragmented across an empire leaving behind silence and myth. To the east, however, a more formidable challenge emerged: Babylon. The south had long been a turbulent region, deeply proud, culturally rich, but politically unstable. A powerful Chaldean named Marduk-apla-iddina II, also called Merodach-Baladan, declared himself king of Babylon and rallied anti-Assyrian sentiment. He secured alliances with Elam to the east and claimed legitimacy in the name of Marduk, Babylon's chief deity. Sargon responded with force and symbolism. He invaded defeated Merodach-Baladan, and in 710 BCE entered Babylon, not just as a conqueror, but as a worshipper. He performed the sacred Akitu festival, carried the statue of Marduk through the streets, and proclaimed himself King of Babylon. In doing so, he merged Assyrian political authority with Babylonian spiritual legitimacy. It was a masterstroke, both military and theological. But holding Babylon was never easy. Its people despised foreign rule, its nobility plotted constantly, and its scribes chronicled every misstep. Sargon would spend the rest of his reign balancing this delicate relationship, part ruler, part guest, part divine servant. Then came the western horizon, Egypt. The Nile had long been outside Assyria's grasp. Its vast deserts, powerful armies, and dynastic culture made it a distant dream. But Sargon looked to the Levant, where Egypt's influence was rising, especially among the Philistine cities and kingdoms like Ashdod. When rebellion broke out in Ashdod with Egyptian support, Sargon marched. His campaign was swift. He stormed Ashdod, crushed the Egyptian-backed uprising, and declared to the world that Egypt had failed to stop Assyria's advance. Though he never crossed into the Nile Valley, the message was clear: even mighty Egypt could not protect its allies. This wasn't just war. It was psychological conquest. Sargon's reach extended beyond the battlefield. He commissioned inscriptions and monumental art that portrayed him as divine, just, and irresistible. In one inscription, he claimed, "I am the king who commands obedience at the edge of the world." To enshrine his legacy, he built a new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, the fortress of Sargon. Located near Nineveh, it was a planned city square in layout, massive in scale, filled with palaces, temples, and administrative quarters. Reliefs inside depicted scenes of conquest, tribute lion hunts, and divine processions. The city was meant to embody power order carved in stone. But fate has little regard for architecture. In 705 BCE, Sargon marched eastward against the Sumerians, a fierce nomadic people threatening the empire's borders. In an unexpected turn, Sargon was killed in battle. His body was never recovered. No triumph, no burial, no final inscription. To the Assyrians, this was more than tragedy, it was an omen. A king who had ruled in the name of the gods had fallen without closure. The divine balance had been disturbed. His new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, was abandoned almost immediately. His son, Sennacherib, would move the court to Nineveh and erase his father's architectural legacy. Yet Sargon II had already reshaped the world. He had captured Samaria and scattered a nation. He had entered Babylon and worn its crown. He had challenged Egypt and emerged unscathed. And in doing so, he had proven that the Assyrian Empire was not just the strongest in the world, it was the center of it. 13. The Lion Hunts of Sennacherib. When Sargon II died unexpectedly in 705 BCE, the empire was left in shock. His body was never recovered, a deeply ominous sign in the ancient Mesopotamian worldview. For the Assyrians to die unburied was to fall into cosmic disfavor, abandoned not just by man, but by the gods. The question loomed: had Assyria lost its divine protection? Into this shadow stepped his son, Sennacherib. Sennacherib 705 to 681 BCE, inherited a vast empire and a deep crisis. Babylon was unstable. Rebellions simmered in the west. The memory of his father's mysterious death haunted the court. His answer was clear: assert dominance, rebuild the center of power, and remind the world that Assyria still stood at the height of its might. And he did so with ruthless brilliance. His first major act was political and symbolic. He abandoned Dur-Sharrukin, the glittering but now cursed capital his father had built, and moved the royal seat to Nineveh. At the time, Nineveh was already an important city. Under Sennacherib, it became a marvel. He launched one of the most ambitious construction programs in ancient history. He expanded Nineveh's walls to enclose over 1,800 acres, large enough to hold sprawling palaces, lush gardens, and entire districts. He built canals, aqueducts, and water systems so advanced that modern archaeologists still study their engineering. His palace without rival, as he called it, was decorated with endless reliefs of military victories, tribute scenes, and most famously, royal lion hunts. The lion hunt was more than a sport. It was theater. It was ideology made visible. Sennacherib is often depicted in these scenes standing in a chariot bow, drawn as lions charge toward him. The message was clear: chaos, the lion submits to order the king. These images reinforced a foundational principle of Assyrian rule. The king is the defender of civilization, the breaker of disorder, and the chosen of the gods. But his reign was not all theater. In 701 BCE, Sennacherib launched one of the most infamous campaigns in biblical history, the Siege of Jerusalem. The kingdom of Judah, led by King Hezekiah, had rebelled against Assyrian authority. With Egyptian encouragement, Judah refused tribute and fortified its cities. Sennacherib responded with overwhelming force. He marched into the Levant, capturing 46 fortified cities in Judah, devastating the countryside and deporting tens of thousands. When he reached Jerusalem, he laid siege. The Bible records that an angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in the night, forcing Sennacherib to retreat. The Assyrian records, by contrast, claim he trapped Hezekiah like a bird in a cage and extracted tribute, but did not destroy the city. Scholars debate the full truth. What's clear is that Jerusalem survived, but at a heavy cost. Sennacherib turned his attention next to Babylon. The city had once again rebelled, this time under a new Chaldean leader, and Sennacherib had had enough. In 689 BCE, after years of fighting, he ordered Babylon destroyed, not just defeated, but erased. Temples were looted, statues smashed, canals filled with rubble. The city's symbolic heart, the Temple of Marduk, was razed. He deported or slaughtered its inhabitants and declared the site cursed. It was an unprecedented act. For centuries, Babylon had been the cultural and religious center of southern Mesopotamia. Even Assyrian kings had typically treated it with reverence. Sennacherib's decision shocked the region. Some in his court were horrified. Others whispered of blasphemy. But Sennacherib saw it as necessity. Order had to be absolute. Mercy was weakness. He ruled not just through power, but through architecture and image. His capital, Nineveh, was designed to awe. His reliefs told a story of invincibility. His waterworks turned barren plains into fertile land. His military turned rebellion into dust. Yet his final years were darkened by strife. In 681 BCE, Sennacherib was assassinated, murdered by two of his own sons in a palace coup. The assassination was not just personal, it was political. Discontent had simmered beneath the surface of his iron-fisted rule. He had destroyed Babylon, but Babylon would rise again. He had ruled by fear, but even fear had limits. Still, Sennacherib left a city that stood unmatched, a capital where power flowed through stone, water, and symbol, a model for kings to come and a warning for those who reached too far. In his place rose a new king, Esarhaddon. He would inherit a throne tainted by blood, and he would look not just to the east or the west, but to the south, toward Egypt. 14. The last great king, Esarhaddon, and the conquest of Egypt. When Sennacherib fell to the daggers of his own sons in 681 BCE, the empire teetered. The royal palace was soaked in betrayal. Assassination, in Assyrian culture, wasn't just a political act, it was a breach in divine order. For an empire that saw its king as the chosen of the gods, the murder of a monarch brought with it not just succession crisis, but cosmic anxiety. But amid the chaos, one son, Esarhaddon, emerged. He had not been the heir apparent. In fact, his older brothers were responsible for the assassination, hoping to claim the throne themselves. But Esarhaddon acted swiftly. With loyal support from the army and the priesthood, he seized power. His first act as king was vengeance. He hunted down his brothers, executed their allies, and restored order. And then, remarkably, he did something few expected. He rebuilt Babylon. In a gesture of reconciliation, Esarhaddon reversed his father's policy of total destruction. He ordered the reconstruction of temples, restored Marduk's statue, and proclaimed himself not only king of Assyria, but also king of Babylon. He emphasized humility in his inscriptions, stating that the gods had been angered and now sought peace. It was a political masterstroke. By healing the wound his father had opened, Esarhaddon re-established Assyrian authority in the south, not through terror, but through restoration. But make no mistake, he was no soft ruler. Esarhaddon's reign, 681 to 669 BCE, would be one of relentless ambition, and his gaze turned where Assyrian kings had long dreamed: Egypt. Egypt had been meddling in Levantine politics for generations, supporting rebels, funding uprisings, and threatening Assyrian hegemony. For Esarhaddon, enough was enough. In 674 BCE, he launched his first invasion into the Nile Valley. It failed. Disease, distance, and heat took their toll. The Egyptian pharaoh Taharka, a Kushite from the 25th dynasty, repelled the Assyrian advance. But Esarhaddon was not deterred. 3 years later, in 671 BCE, he returned with a larger, better prepared force. This time the campaign succeeded. His army swept through the Sinai, across the Delta, and into Memphis, one of Egypt's great cities. Taharka fled south. Egyptian nobles submitted, some willingly, others under duress. Esarhaddon declared himself king of Egypt, patron of the gods and ruler of the world. It was the first time in history that a Mesopotamian power had conquered Egypt. For centuries, these two civilizations, cradles of ancient civilization, had watched each other from afar. Now they were bound under one crown. But Egypt was no easy prize. Esarhaddon installed vassal rulers and governors, but the land was vast, decentralized, and proud. Cultural resistance simmered. Rebellions would follow in the years to come. Still, the scale of what Esarhaddon had achieved was immense. His empire now stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Nile, from the mountains of Urartu to the deserts of Arabia. It was the largest empire the world had seen to that point. Internally, he continued the administrative reforms begun by his grandfather, Tiglath-Pileser III. He improved the postal system, codified taxation, and enforced loyalty through a network of spies and informants. His scribes kept records on everything from grain tallies to celestial omens. And perhaps more than any king before him, Esarhaddon thought about legacy. Aware of the risks of civil war, he made a radical decision. He divided power between his two sons. The elder Ashurbanipal would rule Assyria. The younger Shamash-Shum-Ukin would rule Babylon. Both would take the throne after Esarhaddon's death, but the balance would be delicate, and ultimately doomed. In 669 BCE, Esarhaddon died en route to a third Egyptian campaign. His body was returned to Nineveh and buried with royal honors. His reign had been brief but transformative. He had restored Babylon, conquered Egypt, and stabilized an empire battered by revolt and betrayal. But the seeds he had planted, two kings, one empire, would soon sprout conflict. And under his son Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian Empire would reach its dazzling, brutal peak. 15. Ashurbanipal and the Library of Empire. Ashurbanipal ascended the Assyrian throne in 669 BCE, a time when the empire stood at its zenith. It spanned from the mountains of Armenia to the oases of Arabia, from the western gates of Egypt to the marshlands of Elam. Its armies were feared. Its bureaucracy was unmatched. Its cities overflowed with tribute captives and splendor. But Ashurbanipal, unlike many warrior kings before him, was more than a general. He was a scholar, and his reign would be marked not just by blood and iron, but by clay and ink. From the beginning, Ashurbanipal presented himself as a king of balance, master of the sword and of the stylus. In his inscriptions, he proudly declared, "I, Ashurbanipal, learned the art of the scribe. I read the stone carvings from before the flood. I understand the wisdom of Ea, the secrets of heaven and earth." He was the only Assyrian king known to have been fully literate. He did not merely commission scholars, he joined them. He collected tablets on medicine, astronomy, history, incantation, and law. He sought copies of ancient texts from every city under his control. Babylon, Nippur, Sippar, Uruk, and ordered them to be brought to Nineveh. His scribes worked tirelessly to translate and preserve them. This collection would become the legendary Library of Ashurbanipal, the world's first great archive of human knowledge. Tens of thousands of tablets were stored in carefully catalogued rooms within his palace. Some bore colophons instructing future readers to handle them with care. Others warned of divine punishment should they be stolen. Among them was the Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in near-complete form, an echo from the deepest layers of Mesopotamian memory. But Ashurbanipal was not merely a philosopher-king. His reign was also one of relentless warfare. His most brutal campaigns were in Elam to the east, Assyria's long-standing rival. The Elamites had dared to support his rebellious brother Shamash-Shum-Ukin, whom Ashurbanipal had installed as king of Babylon in accordance with their father's dying wishes. At first, the arrangement held, but tensions rose. Babylon, long resentful of Assyrian dominance, began plotting in secret. In 652 BCE, civil war erupted. Shamash-Shum-Ukin, backed by Elam and other regional powers, declared himself the true ruler. Ashurbanipal responded with overwhelming force. The war was prolonged and catastrophic. Babylon was besieged. Its allies were crushed. Elam, once a proud kingdom, was devastated. Its cities were burned, its gods stolen, its royal tombs desecrated. In one chilling inscription, Ashurbanipal writes that he salted the land so nothing would grow. Heads of defeated kings were paraded through the streets of Nineveh. Babylon fell too. Its rebellion quelled, its temples once again restored, but always under watchful Assyrian eyes. Meanwhile, to the west, Ashurbanipal continued his father's Egyptian policy. He installed loyal rulers in the Nile Delta and campaigned deep into Thebes. But Egypt was never truly tame. Each rebellion required another march, another suppression, and with each campaign, Assyria grew more exhausted. At home, the empire's administrative machine continued to function efficiently, but increasingly strained. Deportations continued, spreading Arameans, Elamites, Hebrews, and Egyptians across the empire to work as craftsmen, farmers, or soldiers. The king's scribes still recorded every tax, every omen, every shipment of barley. But cracks were forming. By the final years of Ashurbanipal's reign, Assyria remained outwardly strong, but within discontent simmered. The empire had reached too far. Its armies were tired. Its provinces were tense. Its subject peoples resented the weight of imperial control. The balance between fear and loyalty was beginning to tilt. Ashurbanipal died in 631 BCE. His final years are poorly recorded. His death undramatic, but his legacy immense. He left behind an empire still whole but stretched, a capital Nineveh resplendent with palaces and libraries, and a memory of a king who stood not just as a destroyer, but as a preserver. The world had never known an empire so vast, a ruler so cultured, a state so terrifying, and it would never see one like it again. The storm clouds were gathering. Assyria, undefeated in war, would soon crumble from within. 16. A house-divided civil war and decline. Ashurbanipal's death in 631 BCE marked more than the end of a reign. It signaled the beginning of a slow, painful unraveling of the Assyrian Empire. Though his legacy was grand and his dominion vast, the forces that would bring Assyria to its knees were already in motion, quietly eroding the foundations of power from within. There was no clear succession. No dominant heir was proclaimed. No smooth transfer of authority. Instead, rival claimants, possibly his sons or nephews, emerged in rapid succession. Names like Ashur-etil-ilani and Sinshar-ishkun would momentarily sit on the throne, but neither possessed the charisma, control, or commanding authority of their predecessors. The empire was still vast on paper, but it had begun to lose the one thing that had always held it together: fear. The civil war that had engulfed Ashurbanipal's reign in Babylon had already revealed a fundamental truth: Assyria's greatest weapon, fear, was also its most dangerous weakness. It had ruled through terror for centuries. Cities were razed, rebels flayed, populations deported. This brought order, but not loyalty. When the iron grip loosened, the oppressed did not mourn. They rose. The provinces that once trembled now hesitated. Then they resisted. Babylon, ever restless, sensed opportunity. The Chaldeans, once crushed by Ashurbanipal, began organizing again under a leader named Nabopolassar, a commander of Babylonian extraction. By 626 BCE, he had declared himself king. This wasn't just rebellion, it was a declaration of independence. At the same time, from the east, a new power stirred: the Medes, an Indo-Iranian people dwelling in the Zagros highlands. Long dismissed as a tribal nuisance, they had grown stronger, more unified. Led by a warrior king named Cyaxares, the Medes began launching raids not just on border towns, but deep into Assyrian territory. And there was another factor, perhaps the most damning of all: loss of trust within the heartland. Governors once loyal to Nineveh began hedging their bets. Some withheld troops, others delayed taxes. The Assyrian military, once the most disciplined and feared in the ancient world, now suffered from desertions, morale collapse, and lack of reinforcements. When rebellion flared, there were fewer willing to march. What made Assyria strong: centralized command, total loyalty to the king, rapid communication, now worked in reverse. When the top fractured, the whole system staggered. The royal court became a nest of paranoia. Factions formed. Ministers were purged. Generals distrusted each other. The clarity of Ashurbanipal's rule gave way to confusion. Cities that had been Assyrian for generations, Arafa-Kalhu, Arbela, saw their local populations turn indifferent or even hostile. Once they had sent troops to Nineveh. Now they listened to new voices from Babylon, from Media, from within their own temples. And the Medes did not come alone. By the 610s BCE, An unprecedented coalition had formed Babylonians, Medes, Scythians, and Cimmerians, diverse peoples who had once fought each other, now united by one goal: the destruction of Nineveh. They moved not as isolated raiders, but as a coordinated force, striking fortresses, cutting roads, burning crops, starving cities. Siege after siege, resistance was broken. Assyrian outposts that had once been impregnable now fell in days. Assyrian kings still issued proclamations. They still performed rituals, still summoned gods, but the gods had grown silent. This was not a swift collapse. It was a grinding descent, like a mountain crumbling from within. Assyria was hollowed by betrayal, fatigue, and the sins of its own rule. And yet the heart still beat. The final defenders gathered in Nineveh, the empire's grandest city, ringed by massive walls filled with treasure libraries and the weight of 3 centuries of rule. But outside those walls, the coalition tightened its grip. In 612 BCE, they would strike, and the city that had once been the symbol of terror and glory would face its judgment. 17. The fall of Nineveh. The year was 612 BCE. The Assyrian Empire, once a juggernaut of iron, fear, and fire, stood on its last legs, and Nineveh, its crown jewel, its citadel of terror and wonder, now faced the most ruthless siege the ancient world had yet seen. The city itself had long been a monument to imperial ambition. Enclosed by massive walls stretching over 7 miles, fortified with more than 15 gates, guarded by thousands of soldiers, and fed by a complex web of canals and granaries, Nineveh had been built to withstand anything. Its palaces gleamed with alabaster reliefs. Its gardens mimicked paradise. Its archives held the collected knowledge of millennia. But the armies outside its walls were not raiders or scattered rebels. They were an alliance forged in vengeance. The Babylonians under King Nabopolassar had spent the last decade methodically retaking former Assyrian territories to the south. With each victory, they not only reclaimed land, they gained momentum. The Medes, led by King Cyaxares, had descended from the eastern highlands with a disciplined army hardened by decades of tribal warfare. They sought not tribute, but retribution. The Scythians and Cimmerians, nomadic warriors from the steppe, joined the coalition, bringing chaos, speed, and fury. Though often seen as barbarians by city-states, they were deadly allies, unpredictable and relentless. Together, this army marched to Nineveh. The siege began in earnest. For weeks, perhaps months, they battered the city's defenses. Siege ramps were raised. Walls were assaulted. Gates were burned. The Assyrian defenders, led by King Sin-shar-ishkun, resisted with everything they had left. But the numbers and the will of the gods had shifted. Babylonian records speak of torrential rains, floods that swelled the rivers and eroded the city's defenses. According to one chronicle, the Tigris River breached its bank, collapsing part of the wall and allowing the attackers to pour in. What followed was not conquest. It was annihilation. The coalition did not seek to rule Nineveh, they came to erase it. Palaces were torched. Temples were looted. Statues of Assur and Ishtar were dragged through the streets, shattered and desecrated. Libraries, despite their brilliance, were buried beneath rubble and ash. The royal family was slaughtered or vanished. Sin-shar-ishkun is believed to have died during the siege, whether by fire, sword, or suicide remains unknown. The destruction was so total, so unimaginable, that for centuries Nineveh was thought to be myth, its ruins lost beneath desert and time. And with its fall, the Assyrian Empire was broken. Not entirely gone, some loyalist forces would flee to Haran, regroup, and attempt a final stand. But the heart had stopped beating. Nineveh had symbolized everything. Assyria was brutal, brilliant, imperial, divine. Its destruction was both literal and symbolic. a reckoning. To the Babylonians and their allies, this was justice for centuries of subjugation, deportation, and slaughter. To others, it was the end of an era, the close of a chapter that had shaped the ancient world through roads writing warfare and centralized statecraft. To the Assyrians, it was apocalypse. As smoke rose over the ruins, a world built on domination and fear gave way to something new. But one king remained, in exile, in desperation, and he would fight for what little remained of Assyria's shattered crown. 18. Ashurbanipal II and the final stand. With Nineveh reduced to ash in 612 BCE, it seemed as if the Assyrian Empire had drawn its last breath. Its palaces were gone, its temples desecrated. Its capital, once the terrifying symbol of unstoppable force, was now a heap of broken stone. But empires do not die in a day. In the wake of disaster, a fragment of Assyria still stirred. His name was Ashurbanipal II. Little is known of him, no grand inscriptions, no carved reliefs, no victories carved in stone. But in the darkest moment of Assyrian history, he rose as the final king crowned in exile. Not in Nineveh, not in Ashur, but in Haran, a far-flung city to the west, near the bend of the Euphrates. There he tried to ignite the last ember of a dying empire. He rallied the remaining Assyrian elite, royal guards, loyal governors, surviving scribes, priests, and refugees. But his forces were fractured. The heartland was gone. The treasury was empty. And worse, the world had changed. The coalition that had destroyed Nineveh was not content to stop. Babylon under Nabopolassar now claimed southern Mesopotamia and had its sights on full domination. The Medes under Cyaxares controlled the northern reaches from the Zagros to former Assyrian strongholds in the east. Ashurbanipal knew he could not survive alone, so he turned to Egypt. The Saite dynasty under Pharaoh Necho II still remembered the days when Assyria had marched into the Nile Delta. And though Egypt had once resisted Assyrian domination, the new threat of Babylonian expansion was more immediate. In a dramatic reversal, Egypt became Assyria's final ally. In 609 BCE, Egyptian forces joined Ashurbanipal II in Haran, hoping to prevent Babylon and the Medes from claiming full hegemony in the Fertile Crescent. It was a desperate gamble. Together, the remnants of two fading powers made a stand. The battle for Haran was fierce. The city, though fortified, could not withstand the full force of Babylonian and Median armies. The coalition forces breached the walls. Ashurbanipal and his Egyptian allies were forced to retreat westward toward Carchemish near the Euphrates. Haran fell, and with it, the last functioning Assyrian capital. Still, Ashurbanipal II refused to surrender. In 605 BCE, the final confrontation came the Battle of Carchemish. On one side stood the Egyptians and Assyrian exiles. On the other, the Babylonians, led now by Nebuchadnezzar II, son of Nabopolassar. The outcome was decisive. The Babylonians crushed their enemies. Egyptian forces were driven back. Assyrian survivors were slaughtered or scattered. Ashurbanipal II vanished from history, whether killed in battle or fleeing into obscurity, no one knows. But with that defeat, the Assyrian Empire ceased to exist. It had ruled the Near East for nearly 300 years, terrorizing, organizing, innovating, and reshaping the world. But now it was gone. Its cities burned. Its people dispersed. Its kings forgotten. In the centuries to come, the name Assyria would become a ghost, a ruin whispered of in distant lands, a warning, a memory. But in its final hours, even as all fell apart, Assyria fought. And though its end was violent and irrevocable, it did not go quietly. 19. What made Assyria so powerful? Assyria's fall was dramatic, brutal, and total. But its rise, its breathtaking ascent from a modest trade city on the Tigris to the first true superpower of the ancient world was no accident. It was the result of a perfect storm of military ingenuity, administrative brilliance, psychological manipulation, and religious ideology. To understand Assyria's power, we must first understand its military innovation. Assyria built the first modern army the world had ever seen. Not just in size, but in structure. It was professional standing and versatile. The king could call upon infantry, cavalry, chariots, and siege engineers. Each campaign was methodically planned, supplied by depots, coordinated through a network of messengers, and reinforced with fresh troops from across the empire. They pioneered siege warfare, battering rams, sappers, and scaling ladders capable of reducing the strongest city walls. Cavalry units operated independently of chariots, offering speed and flexibility. Engineers designed bridges, pontoon crossings, and siege ramps. But what made Assyrian war so effective was not just strategy. It was fear. Assyria practiced what can only be called psychological warfare. Its kings didn't simply conquer, they crushed. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Captured kings were humiliated, flayed, or paraded in chains. Heads lined city gates. Skins were nailed to walls. These horrors weren't hidden, they were carved into palace reliefs and described in royal inscriptions. Terror became a form of control. Survival meant submission. But this fear was sustained by an efficient and ruthless administrative system. After conquest, lands weren't left to their own devices. They were absorbed, reorganized, and integrated into the empire. Provinces were established, each governed by an official loyal to the king. These governors collected taxes, conscripted soldiers, enforced laws, and sent detailed reports back to the capital. Assyria's road system, carefully patrolled and supplied, allowed for rapid movement of troops and messages. It was a logistical feat, connecting far-flung corners of the empire with central command. Deportation was another instrument of control. Assyrians relocated entire populations, tens or hundreds of thousands at a time, not as punishment alone but as policy. Skilled workers were moved where they were needed. Hostile tribes were broken up and scattered. These actions diluted nationalism, reduced rebellion, and allowed for faster cultural assimilation. In many ways, Assyria created the world's first multi-ethnic empire not by tolerance, but by forced integration. And binding all of this was ideology. The Assyrian king was not just a ruler, he was the agent of the gods. Chief among them was Ashur, whose will was conquest. War wasn't simply politics, it was religious duty. Victory proved divine favor. Rebellion was not just crime, it was heresy. The empire's inscriptions often stated that conquered lands were given to the king by Ashur himself, that Assyrian power was the natural divine order of the world. This belief system justified expansion and inspired obedience. Propaganda played its part. Palace walls depicted orderly tribute processions, defeated enemies groveling, and the king portrayed as taller, stronger, divine. Even the architecture, the towering ziggurats, the monumental gates, the immense scale of capitals like Nineveh, was built to remind everyone, Assyrian and foreign alike, you are beneath this power. But perhaps most surprising of all was how Assyria preserved knowledge. Despite its violence, Assyria revered scholarship. The library of Ashurbanipal housed texts from across Mesopotamia. Scribes copied tablets on medicine, astronomy, literature, and law. They preserved Sumerian, Akkadian, and even foreign writings. Assyria wasn't only a state of war, it was a state of memory. In this paradox lay its strength. Brutality with precision, conquest with vision, fear with permanence. No single trait made Assyria dominant. It was the combination of all, a war machine with a priest-king at its center, a bureaucracy that reached every village, and an ideology that left no room for compromise. It was magnificent. It was monstrous. And in its success, it sowed the seeds of its fall. For what is built on fear can never know peace, and in the end, even fear cracks. 20. The legacy in clay and blood. The Assyrian Empire fell in fire, but it did not vanish. Long after the walls of Nineveh crumbled and its palaces turned to dust, echoes of Assyria continued to shape the world. In clay tablets buried beneath rubble, in stone reliefs found in ruined gates, and in the bureaucratic systems of those who came after, Assyria lived on not as a memory alone, but as a foundation. Its legacy was carved in blood, but also in blueprint. First, it shaped Babylon. Though the Babylonians had fought bitterly against Assyrian rule, their eventual empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar II, copied much of the Assyrian model. They inherited the provincial systems, the deportation policies, the monumental building programs, and even the language of divine kingship. Babylon's grandeur in the 6th century BCE, from the Ishtar Gate to the Hanging Gardens, bore the fingerprint of Assyrian urban planning. Then came the Persians. When Cyrus the Great forged the Achaemenid Empire, the largest in the ancient world, he did so by building upon Assyrian infrastructure. Persian satrapies mirrored Assyrian provinces. Their use of royal roads, military couriers, and multi-ethnic armies echoed Assyria's own innovations. Even the idea of divine kingship, tempered though it was, with Persian tolerance, followed a precedent the Assyrians had long established. Administratively, Assyria had written the manual for empire. But its legacy wasn't only political, it was linguistic and cultural. The Akkadian language, once the lingua franca of diplomacy, had been preserved on thousands of clay tablets. Through the efforts of Assyrian scribes, these texts were copied and recopied: hymns, omens, epics, laws. They gave us the Epic of Gilgamesh, tales of the flood, and some of the earliest maps and medical records in history. It was only in the 19th century, through excavations at Nineveh and the decoding of cuneiform, that the modern world rediscovered this vast archive. The library of Ashurbanipal alone yielded over 30,000 tablets, giving voice to a civilization thought lost forever. In this way, Assyria's greatest contribution may have come after its fall. It preserved the past. And yet, its legacy is also moral. Assyria remains one of the clearest examples of the paradox of power. Its empire brought order, but at the cost of autonomy. It built roads and cities, but also leveled others to the ground. It preserved knowledge, but erased cultures. Its kings saw themselves as chosen by the gods, yet fell like all men do. Modern historians still debate how to judge Assyria. Was it the first true empire? The first totalitarian state? A civilizing force or a machine of destruction? Perhaps the truth is both. Assyria was the mirror of civilization, at its most organized and its most violent. It showed what humanity could achieve and what it could become in pursuit of control. Even today, in the war-torn landscapes of modern Iraq and Syria, the ruins of ancient Assyria remain under sand, under siege, under threat, but still standing, still whispering, still reminding us that no empire, no matter how vast, is eternal, and that in the end, what survives is not the sword, but the story.